What is up, WHAP? Okay, so we are doing the second half of the Industrial Revolution PowerPoint, which is quite lengthy. In last lecture, we discussed heavily about the amount of industrialization in the West, what becomes known as the Western powers, starting with England and then France and Germany, to a lesser extent, Russia, and then of course the United States, which starts slowly but then becomes the most powerful manufacturing country in the world. Now we know that because of industrialization, that we see the increase in military capacities for these countries because you can produce so many more weapons of war, and we also see that increased desire for raw materials and more consumers. Thus, industrialization is going to lead to a second wave of colonization or imperialism, and that's kind of the last major theme of this time period, and it will be in our final unit, the age of imperialism. So while we see Western countries start to industrialize, start to become more powerful, and start to look for new areas for imperialism, the East now needs to respond. The East can either go through industrialization themselves and not be the target of imperialism, or they will resist imperialism. And of course, if that happens, they will be the target of imperialism. So when we look at these four countries that we discuss now, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, China, and Japan, we have to look at them through the lens of, are they going to industrialize? And if they don't, then are they going to be the targets of imperialism? Two of these states are going to industrialize and they're going to be able to defend themselves. Two of these states will not. And you may be asking yourself, why would any country not industrialize? That doesn't make sense. Well, obviously, that conservatives in any country, people with power, if they see that they are going to lose power or influence in their country because of change, that they're going to resist change. That's what conservatives do. They're in power, so they resist change. And so to that point, when you look at places like China, where do you see the scholar gentry class? Scholar gentry class are the highest classes in China, and they got there by studying Confucianism. And Confucianism is always rewards tradition, and they reward the way that things have always been. And farmers were glorified in Confucianism because they contribute to society. And so, for instance, conservatives in China are going to resist the changes that come with industrialization. I'm going to pause briefly for 1 second while I help my wife bring in groceries. So give me 1 second here. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So we are going to talk in the lens of these four countries. How do they industrialize, and if not, what happens to them? So we'll start with the Ottoman Empire, and actually Ottoman Empire and Egypt are kind of one of the same. So first of all, the Ottoman Empire. Why? What's their status right now? They were one of our gunpowder empires, our three gunpowder empires that were established after the fall of the Mongols, and they were established in the time period between 1450 and 1750. So here we are between 1750 and 1900, and this is our last standing gunpowder empire, but it's falling apart. And it's falling apart largely for several reasons. For one, they're falling behind in technology. They're also didn't go through the Enlightenment, so their government is very outdated. They still have one leader, the Shah, or the Sultan in this case, that is ruling over the entire empire. Because of harem politics and other corruption, the government isn't respected anymore, and Europeans are coming in and seizing land from the Ottoman Empire. And then perhaps the biggest reason why the Ottoman Empire is falling apart is because of nationalism. As it is an empire, we have different nationalities throughout the empire, and because of Enlightenment ideals reaching Europe, we have, for instance, these nations in here, like what becomes Serbia and Albania and Greece. These nations are going to break away from the Ottoman Empire because they want to rule themselves. They want to rule themselves and people of their same nationality, which of course is nationalism. Now, Egypt is going to break away from the Ottoman Empire. In fact, at first it was conquered by a group called the Mamluks. And then the Ottoman Empire is going to send in an army that is led by an Albanian officer, Muhammad Ali, to come in and reconquer Egypt. He does reconquer Egypt. And then, because people are so loyal to him, his soldiers are so loyal to him, they ask him to be the governor of Egypt. Now, the Ottoman Sultan at this stage is so unpopular. The Ottoman government is so unpopular that he doesn't have any power to really go against the will of the people. And so, because of this, Muhammad Ali becomes our new leader of Egypt. And he is going to start immediately to kind of break away from the Ottoman Empire. And Egypt pretty much comes its own sovereign, autonomous state. He's going to act independently of the Sultan. He's going to join the Sultan when it benefits him and when it benefits Egypt. But otherwise, he's going to go on conquests of expansion only to benefit Egypt. And so he goes in and he conquers area in Africa, conquers the Sudan, and then he goes and captures Syria in the Middle East. And he adds these land to Egypt without the Sultan's permission. So Egypt is essentially now its own country, its own state. And that's important because Muhammad Ali is going to change Egypt in ways that the Ottoman Empire does not go through these types of changes. Muhammad Ali is going to westernize Egypt. He looks to the West as the most advanced civilization. And so he wants the Egypt to be much more like Europe. And he's very much like Peter the Great in this way, in trying to westernize and modernize his state. So he's going to send officers to France to get educated and learn from the military academies over in Europe and to base their military off of the European model. By comparison, if you look at the Ottoman military, the Ottoman Empire military, they're still using janissaries, right? And so now we have over in France, for instance, they use a draft. They go to military training. They come in and fight. And so this is a very big change between the Ottoman Empire. Egypt is now becoming more like Europe. Muhammad Ali also starts a new newspaper, which will be the first newspaper in the Islamic world. He's also going to westernize and take control of the economy of Egypt. Very much like Peter the Great. Muhammad Ali is going to tax the peasants. He's going to force those peasants, because they can no longer pay taxes on their land. They're going to sell their land to the state, and then he's going to use this land and create state-controlled massive farms. Also, religious elites in Egypt control a lot of the land. He secularizes these lands, meaning he makes them no longer control over the religious elites of the country. He has all of this land, and now the government controls huge amounts of lands to be devoted to cotton and wheat, especially cotton. And this is going to do wonderful things for the Egyptian economy, because we see big demands for cotton, especially when the American Civil War occurs. We know that the South, the southern states, were providing lots of cotton for places like England, who industrialized in the textile industry. And southern planters were feeding the English textile mills. Well, of course, when the South is now in civil war, they're no longer farming cotton. And so England needs its cotton from somewhere else. It's already getting it from India, but it needs even more. And so Egypt fills that role during the American Civil War to provide cotton to England. And not only that, but Ali is also going to push Egypt to industrialize and to form its own textile factories to compete with Britain and France. And so Egypt is becoming a rival state to European states because of this man, Muhammad Ali. We already talked about modernizing the military, but he also gets armaments factories built in Cairo, which of course is in Egypt. Armaments, when you see armaments, that means weapons, arms, and shipbuilding factories in Alexandria. And so because of all of these changes, Muhammad Ali is called the first great modern ruler of Egypt. And he is going to be responsible for really protecting Egypt from imperialism when the rest of the Ottoman Empire is really subject to lots of imperialism. Japan is another country that is going to industrialize and save itself from the exploits of Europeans. A little bit of context on Japan. In our last time period, 1450 to 1750, of course, our Europeans ventured into the Indian Ocean. And when they did so, we saw missionaries, first the Portuguese missionaries, later the Dutch missionaries, make their way all the way over to Japan. However, the Japanese rulers at the time were not so happy that these missionaries are coming in and converting people to Christianity, Buddhism heavily implemented in Japan. And because of this, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, our second unifier of Japan, is going to ban all Christian worship in Japan. In fact, by the 1630s, all the foreigners were expelled from the country. They really rebelled and resisted against all of this influence from Western powers. And so Japan sinks into complete isolation. Foreign books prohibited, travel abroad forbidden. The only people they're trading with is, on a very limited scale, the Chinese and the Dutch. No Western trade involved at all, besides gunpowder weapons from the Dutch. Then things change in 1853. The United States has recently industrialized and has become the most powerful manufacturing nation in the world. And they are now looking for more consumers to buy their never-ending amount of products. We want to be able to sell all these manufactured goods. Who can we possibly sell them to? Well, the Japanese aren't trading with anyone, and there's lots of potential consumers in Japan. And so President Millard Fillmore is going to send over Commodore Matthew Perry. He arrives with these big warships, and he comes with a letter from the president, and he hands it to the Japanese, and he says, "We wish to trade with you. Here is a message from our leader asking for trading privileges. You don't have to respond right now, but we will come back in a year with more warships, and we expect your response." And sure enough, when the Americans return a year later, the Japanese are threatened by the United States coming in with all these warships and accept their request to open up trade with the United States. This is the opening of Japan, if you will, and Britain and the Netherlands and Russia are all going to look to Japan as well to try and open up specific trading privileges with them. So Japan now, all of a sudden, it's been in isolation for hundreds of years. And now all of a sudden, we have all these European nations and the United States knocking on its door, demanding trade concessions. And this obviously is going to threaten the Japanese. And the Japanese are going to have to make some changes to resist imperialism. Looking at the Tokugawa shogunate as it's currently constructed, it is not in a position where it can really effectively resist European or American imperialism. They do have a Tokugawa shogunate, a government, and we have daimyo rulers ruling in each han of the Tokugawa shogunate. But we still have up at the top, we have an emperor who's just a figurehead that it's difficult to enforce laws. And then we have our shoguns, our military dictators that are still ruling the country. That is the descendants of the Tokugawa shogunate. And so because of this, Japan lacks a government that's powerful enough to implement widespread changes throughout Japan. It needs to revolutionize its tax system. It needs to revolutionize its military. It needs to make itself more like the nation states of Europe to be able to resist Western imperialism. And so they go through a massive change called the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is a turning point in Japanese history. It's where they overthrow the shogun and they give the emperor more power. The first emperor here is Emperor Mitsuhito. And Emperor Mitsuhito is going to immediately look to try and find what makes the United States and what makes the Western powers of Europe so powerful. He's going to send out experts to study these Western powers over the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. They're going to come into these European governments and they're going to analyze and study, and then they're going to come back and report to Emperor Mitsuhito on what Japan can do to make their government more like one of those European or American nation states. And they make 4 changes based on this. The first is the Charter Oath. Officially abolishes feudalism. They say these Western countries don't have feudalism anymore. They are practicing capitalism, in which we have these large industries that are aided by the government to mass produce goods. And so they say one of the things we have to do is get rid of feudalism. That doesn't make sense. It's too agricultural. We need more people working in factories and businesses. They also establish a constitutional monarchy. They base it off of Prussia, which is soon to become Germany in 1871. They also look at the Prussian army with a navy and a draft, and they say we need to get rid of our samurai system and get into a more reformed European style army, and then establishing equality before the law, a modern constitution. So all of these things, Japan modernizes, it westernizes, and by doing so becomes an imperialist power itself and resists imperialism from the Western countries. Also, of course, becomes a heavy industrialized country. One of the things that Japan does really, really well, like the United States, is its government directly works towards helping the economy. The government creates a new system that expands education in technical fields. So Japan has been heavily agricultural. Now we are going to try and transform the economy that was so agricultural into a business economy. How are we going to do that? We're going to have to train people to do that. And so the government is literally going to provide subsidies, money, in order to provide education and training for people to learn how to work in these factories. And then, just like the United States, it's also going to provide subsidies for new railroads. It's going to bring the country together and allow businesses to flourish. It's also going to pay for all this. Obviously, if you're providing subsidies, that means that it is money that's being provided from the government to specific businesses. Well, that's money the government's paying. You need to be able to have money in the first place. Where do you get that money? Taxes. One of the really smart things that the Japanese government does at this time is they're going full bore into industrialization. They want to de-emphasize farming and emphasize industrialization. So they levy a really high agricultural tax, a tax on farms. And this is actually a double bonus for the Japanese government because, one, it gives them a lot of money that they can use for subsidies for businesses. And then two, some of those farmers can't afford to be farmers anymore. So what do? They go and work in the factories. They become industrialist factory workers. So the Japanese government really strong throughout this, what we call the Meiji era, the Meiji Restoration, industrialization, makes a lot of really smart decisions. But just like other industrialized states, it's going to go through its problems of industrialization. Obviously, the workers, just like in the United States or Britain or any other industrialized country, we see a class struggle as the people that own the factories become very wealthy. The people that work in the factories really struggle with terrible rights and conditions. Japan is no exception to this. We see that instead of the big state monopolies or the big corporations that emerge in like the United States or Germany or what have you. In Japan, we have these industries that are being controlled by the old daimyo families, the zaibatsu, these powerful Japanese family organizations that start to build more and more control over certain goods or services in Japan. And these companies are going to flourish, but have a unequal distribution of wealth and control over lots of wealth in Japan. A couple of examples of this: the Toyota Loom Works, using at first one of the first machines, the automatic loom for in textiles. It later becomes the Toyota Motor Company that we all know today. Japan now has a situation where it already in 1895 has industrialized, it has changed its military, and now it is looking to expand. For one, it has this massive population. And yet it doesn't, because they're devoting so much land to industrialization, we now have not enough land for agriculture, and we have this big population. We need more lands for agriculture. We need more lands for raw materials to feed industry. Because of this, Japan's first going to look to fight against the Chinese. That is our Sino-Japanese War. Whenever you see Sino, that is China, right? If you're talking about Pax Sinica, that is Chinese peacetime. Sino-Japanese War, that's China versus Japan, and they're fighting over Korea. Korea is influential for both Japan and China. First of all, Korea has been a tributary state of China's since the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century, the 700s. So for over 1,000 years, Korea has been a tributary state of China. This is a really momentous period in history here, because the Japanese, who have always been bullied by the Chinese, are going to come in and defeat the Chinese in combat. They are going to take Taiwan and add it to Japan. They also get land in China, in Manchuria right here, called the Liaodong Peninsula, that has been added to Japan. Now, unfortunately, with events in China, China is being divided up by a bunch of different countries at this stage. The British, the French, the Russians, the Germans. The Liaodong Peninsula there already was part of Russia's sphere of influence. And Russia resents the fact that Japan has now taken this land from China and added it to itself. And so Russia, France, and Germany are going to come together and they're going to say, Japan, give back the Liaodong Peninsula to China so that we can still have free trade there. Well, the Japanese didn't like this, and Japan's going to go and fight a war with Russia now. And the situation is Russia has that sphere of influence on that Liaodong Peninsula, including a port that Russia really, really wanted because it was a warm water port. Finally, it has that port out in the west that it can trade with East Asia, which has always wanted to. But Japan wants that land and it wants Korea. And so Japan is going to surprise attack Russia. And they're going to defeat Russia in this war. And with the Treaty of Portsmouth, which actually was organized by our president, Teddy Roosevelt at the time, we see a lot of big changes. The first European nation to be defeated by an Asian nation in a war, that's Japan defeating Russia. The Liaodong Peninsula goes back to Japan, which starts the Japanese control of Manchuria, which it later invades completely in World War II. Korea now under Japan's control, and now Russia looks like the weak one here. How has Russia been defeated by the Japanese? This is really the beginning of the end of the czars in Russia. Look at our date here, 1904, 1905. We're only 12 years away from the communist revolution, overthrow of the czar. So a lot of change here, but as it relates to industrialization, this is evidence that Japan has successfully industrialized and modernized, and not only has resisted imperialism, has now conducted imperialism in two different places, one into China and two into Russia. So this is an important war to know. It's an important conflict to understand. Okay, so now we'll talk about the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is going to resist industrialization. They're not going to industrialize, and this is going to lead even more to its demise. We did have a sultan, Selim III, that did want to industrialize. He did want to westernize the army. He did want to create bureaucracies that weren't based so much on Islam, but instead based on loyalty to the government. Because, as you know, our Ottoman system of bringing bureaucrats into the government was the Dev Shurma and converting people to be very fiercely loyal to the Sultan that way. But in creating a modern bureaucracy and a westernized army, we're going to have groups that are going to resist these changes. And those are going to be the groups that are most going to lose power here. The Islamic scholars, called the ulama, who don't like the creation of a new bureaucracy because they feel like they would lose power, which they would. And then, of course, our Janissaries, where would they fit in with this new Western army? And so this Ottoman Sultan is actually executed by the Janissaries, by conservatives supported by the Janissaries here. And so, wow, the Ottoman Empire attempts to industrialize and is shot down. This is evidence here of conservatives resisting industrialization. Now, Mehmed II is going to do the things that Selim attempted to do. He's going to get rid of the Janissaries. He's going to develop a new army that's trained by Europeans. When the Janissaries resist, he fights back. He forces them into exile. He also is going to try to change the tax system so military officers can't come in and collect taxes directly. Instead, that the government pays them taxes so they're more loyal to the government. So all of these things here are changes to help the military. And that's a good step in the right direction. But are you going to embrace the factory system? Are you going to embrace giving subsidies to governments? And the answer there is no. The Ottoman Empire does not industrialize. Well, it starts to reform its military, and we'll see also its laws. It does not industrialize, and that makes the difference here. Now, the one other way in which I just mentioned that the Ottoman Empire reforms itself is something called the Tanzimat. the Ottoman Empire, we have to understand this in the context of the problems of the Ottoman Empire right now. The Ottoman Empire is losing land to nationalist revolutions. We have these different ethnicities within the Ottoman Empire that are breaking away. And they're breaking away because they don't feel like they want to be ruled by Turkish people. They want to be ruled by themselves. By if they're Greek, they want to be ruled by Greeks. If they're, Serbian, they want to be ruled by Serbians. And so we see all these nationalist revolutions occur. And the Ottoman Empire is going to try and change this. They're going to try to solve this by updating their government and their laws to make everybody equal under the law. Now, by doing that, however, it's going to create some problems because a lot of those regions within the Ottoman Empire had some sort of relative autonomy. They got to rule over themselves. They got to control their own education in many places. They would have their own court systems. So if the law was broken, they would be tried by a court of people that were of their same ethnicity or religion. And so with this Tanzimat, the idea is to make everyone equal under the law and to de-emphasize Muslim religion as the major reason for law. But in doing this, it's going to actually frustrate many ethnic minorities and religious minorities in the empire because they feel like they are being told to structure their own societies based off of a Ottoman one, off of a Turkish one. So the Tanzimat, rightly intentioned, however, it has the opposite effect. Tanzimat, it's trying to reorganize and update the Ottoman society, taking control of education away from the ulama, creating thousands of secular schools under a ministry of education. Also, the sultans are going to codify the laws, meaning they're going to put them down into constitutions so that everyone can see them. New codes so that it's not just the sultan's law goes and that's it. There's laws that even the sultan has to follow, so kind of following the West in that way. And then this one, the Hatay Humayun, or the Ottoman Reform Edict. This one, I know it's a hard name, but it's actually really important. And it's the best example of changes in the Tanzimat, how while they're well-intentioned, actually have the opposite effect of unifying the empire. This is part of the Tanzimat, and it declared that all men were equal regardless of religion or ethnicity. That sounds great. That sounds like it would totally unify the empire. It did give non-Muslims better access to government positions, but one of the things that really upset religious minorities in the empire was the fact that it established mixed tribunals instead of millets. Okay, so let's break that down. What's a millet? A millet is what existed before the Hatay Humayun, and millets were legal courts that were all different in depending on which religious community you were in. So let's give an example here. So on this map over here, the green is the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, and all the colors are the different religions in the Ottoman Empire. If we go over here to the pink, that's our Christian Armenians over here. There are Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. Now, because of nationalism, our Armenians, many of them wanted to rule themselves, but they didn't have the power to resist the Ottoman Empire, and so they continued to live within the Ottoman Empire, but they lived pretty much as autonomous people, meaning they got to make their own decisions and rule themselves. And one of the ways in which they got to rule themselves was by having millets. Millets were separate legal courts in which they would make decisions based off of their own society, their own religion. The Hatay Humayun, while well-intended, is now getting rid of these millets and saying everybody will be treated equally under the law. Now, that was supposed to unite and bring the Armenians closer together in the empire, but what it actually did was take away one of the defenses that our Christian Armenians had from the Ottoman government, because now they're going to be treated just like everybody else. And so many people are going to resist these changes, resist the Tanzimat, because they are losing in their own eyes some of their autonomy. And that is going to lead to the Russo-Turkish War, where many countries, especially Christians in Southern Europe, are breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. Russia is going to come in and help these countries break away, because Russia is heavily Slavic. These countries are heavily Slavic. And so because of this, the Ottoman Empire is defeated, and we see the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina, of Serbia, of Montenegro, all of these countries. and that is decided at the Congress of Berlin down there. I don't know why this is in black; it's difficult to read, but the one effect of this that is going to lead right into World War One is the fact that Bosnia and Herzegovina, right here, which is a heavily Slavic country in which Russia wanted to be independent, is going to be under the indirect control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Austria-Hungary later annexes Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that deeply upsets Serbia right here, who wanted to be part of Bosnia and Herzegovina as one big Slavic country. And that, of course, leads to beef between these countries and eventually the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. Okay, the Ottomans are going to continue to lose more land to Europe. France is going to come into northern Africa and take out the Algiers, and eventually becoming French West Africa, now today Algeria. Britain is going to come in and take Cyprus down here, and so Europeans are taking more and more control of Ottoman land. And then the Ottoman Empire is going to try and once again bring the country together in assimilation. This was previously called Ottomanism. Now it's called Turkification. And it's either you need to assimilate to our way of life. We have too many different ways of life, too many different ethnicities and religions that are dividing the empire. The majority group are our Turks. And they're saying our young Turks are a political group. They're more radical. And they say, we need change. We need to have everybody follow our religion, our culture, our lifestyle. That is the process of assimilation. Turkification, let's culturally change all citizens of the empire to be more Turkish. Unfortunately, once again, this is going to be resisted by our ethnic and religious minorities, especially our Christian Armenians. This is going to lead to really bad blood in between the Turkish government and our Christian Armenians, eventually resulting in the Armenian genocide during World War I. Okay, we're going to talk about China and Japan. However, I'm going to break right now because I am teaching a class in 7 minutes. So this is a good time to break. So I'm going to pause this thing and then we will finish up as soon as I'm done.